Go ahead and turn back in your Bibles where we were reading earlier together from John, the 21st chapter, verses 15 to 17. And if you want to, you can read before it and you can read after it just to get the context to it. I'll be talking about that as well today. We're continuing on in our sermon series on what the world needs now. And the question is, do you love me? And that question is from Jesus. It was the third time that the disciples had seen the resurrected Lord. And as was typical of Jesus before his resurrection, he was serving them after his resurrection. Not by washing their feet as he had done at the Last Supper, but by preparing them fish and bread to eat at what I'm going to call as the last breakfast. No task was ever beneath Jesus because he always acted out of love. And we all know that love will compel us to do things that we might not otherwise ever do or even consider doing, unless love is what's motivating us to do it. Now, if you're wondering, fish and bread was a common meal back then, even for breakfast, and the disciples seemed to have enjoyed it. And Jesus' choice of it might have reminded them of one of the lessons that he had taught them, which he referred to as the lesson of the loaves, one on trusting Jesus to do the amazing, which was also based on a meal of fish and bread. I've been told that good cooks are not those who want to be known as a good cook or who feel that they should be appreciated for their good cooking skills, but people who have a passion for feeding hungry people. And that's exactly what Jesus did. If you've been really hungry and someone has fed you, you've been especially appreciative of their ability to cook because, man, you were so much wanting it. And that's what Jesus did. So I guess we could call Jesus, he's the great teacher, but he was evidently a great cook as well. When the disciples had finished eating breakfast, Jesus took the opportunity to ask Peter, and we often shorten this question because it's uncomfortable when you read his question. Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" Pointing to the other disciples. The more than these turned this into that awkward question, especially if any of the other disciples had overheard Jesus asking it to Peter. We're not told whether they did or not, but more than likely, if they were all eating together, probably so. Can you imagine sitting at a table and Jesus looks at you and says, "Well, do you love me more than the rest of these guys here?" It's an interesting question, since Jesus would have already known the answer. He would already known what was in Peter's heart, already known his motives. But Peter may not have been certain about his own heart and what was in it. You know, it's easy to be deceived about ourselves. People can tell us a lot of things, and it gets us confused on what we really feel and what we really consider about ourselves. So this seems to be one of those questions that was meant to provide some self-discovery on Peter's part. Some have suggested that Peter wasn't sure about his commitment to follow Jesus at this point in his life. Now that he was a resurrected Lord from the dead, what did it really mean to follow him? What did it mean to go out in his name? Peter led those sorts of questions holding back. Even though he had some questions, he still jumped ahead and led the other disciples. It had been his idea to go fishing the night before while they waited for Jesus to show up as was promised. And after John recognized Jesus on the shore as being, Jesus, it was Peter who jumped into the water and swam straight there first. He was leading the way while the others followed. Of course, they followed all the fish that Jesus had gave them to catch, and they made their way there. The question that Jesus wanted Peter to deal with was Peter ready to lead as Jesus wanted him to lead? I mean, he had all kinds of abilities and leadership qualities, but was he willing to lead in love? Peter had certainly been a leading figure among the disciples over the last 3 years. Some have said that he was a part of what they had become to call the inner circle, along with James and John. But I don't know if that moniker is really an accurate one. After all, these three were only taken aside from the other disciples on 3 different occasions over a 3-year period, but they were important events. The first was whenever Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. They were witnesses of a resurrection. The second was whenever Jesus was transfigured on the mountaintop with Moses and Elijah. And the last was on the night before Jesus was crucified, when Jesus had asked these 3 to accompany him a little bit further beyond everyone else for a time of intensive prayer, which they failed at doing. They all ended up falling asleep, and Jesus prayed alone. But it was Peter who had properly identified Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. It was upon this confession that Jesus said he would build his church, and for being the first one to make it, Jesus told Peter that he would give him the keys of the kingdom. Now, we could talk about that for quite a while and may do so at another time, but Peter had a special place. But Jesus' question to Peter on this morning wasn't, "Are you more special to me than all these others?" It wasn't, "Peter, do you think that I love you more than I love the others?" It was, "Do you, Peter, love me more than these other disciples?" How are you going to answer that, Peter? Peter was bold. He was outspoken. He was impulsive. But on this morning, he held his tongue. Some have argued that Peter wisely avoided answering the question. It could have been a trap. It could have been a test. What if he got the answer wrong? Peter didn't fall for it. He kept his thoughts to himself. However, Peter did affirm his deep and abiding love for Jesus. He would let the other disciples speak for themselves if they were asked. Now, I'm sure that you also noticed in Peter's answer, in his declaration of love, it also includes this insight into Jesus' divine power that may or may not make you uncomfortable. Peter said that Jesus really didn't have a need to ask this question of Peter in the first place because, well, Jesus already knew what was going on in Peter's mind. He already knew his answer. What doesn't come across in this English translation is that Jesus and Peter were using 2 different words for love as they had this exchange. Jesus had asked Peter about agape, that is, about charity, about the kind of love that sees a need and is moved by compassion to meet it. And Peter had spoken about phileo, a familial affection, the kind of love that is shared by brothers, or the kind of love that is shared by friends that is even closer than a brother. Now, it should be pointed out that brothers do not always act like they love one another, right? I mean, we could take Joseph and his brothers as a good example. I mean, they actually came to despise their little brother Joseph for acting like, well, if you read the text back there in that story, sort of like a spoiled brat. I mean, he was sort of acting like he was everyone else, and Dad likes me better than he likes you. And, well, his older brothers got fed up with it, and, well, they did not act very loving toward him. Yes, God may have given him insight to dreams and the ability to interpret, but he didn't seem to be using it in a loving kind of manner, and so it ended up driving a wedge between him and his brothers, and they responded by selling him as a slave. And, well, that's not a very loving thing to do to your brother either. I don't know if you've ever felt that way about someone. Man, life would be better if we just got rid of them. We could do what we wanted. They told their dad that he'd been killed by wild animals, which also was not an act of love. But afterwards, they regretted their harsh behavior. They repented of it. Especially how what they had done to their brother impacted their dad's mental, and some might even say physical health. He was devastated by the loss of his son. But despite their jealousies and their sibling rivalries that rose up, it was their love for one another that brought them back together. Their willingness to forgive one another because they recognized each other as a brother, and they truly, at their deepest level, loved one another. And God used that love to turn this once very divided family into a foundation of a nation that would become God's children. No, Jesus didn't correct Peter's use of a different term for love. Instead, he commanded Peter, "Graze my lambs." Now, some translations have tend or feed. It was a term that was used to refer to an ox. That term gets translated feed. It really meant an ox, or what an ox does whenever it stands in a field and it's not being used at the time. This term became used of any animal that was put in a field because, well, they would be doing the same thing that an ox would do. They would eat. The focus of this word is always on the animal and not the person tending it. So a more literal translation of what Jesus told Peter was, "Let my sheep ox." We would never say it that way, but that's what he told Peter. "Let my sheep eat." Before Peter could respond to Jesus' command, Jesus asked him a less awkward question. "Simon, son of John, do you charity me?" To which Peter responded in exasperation, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you like a brother." Again, no correction, just another command, but this time it was, "Shepherd my sheep." This is a word that focuses on the person looking over the flock. It refers to all that a shepherd would have to do, the leading, the tending, the protecting, in order for the sheep to be able to eat. But before Peter could respond, Jesus asked him yet another question, but this one was an easy question for Peter to answer because Jesus asked, "Peter, do you phileo me?" To which Peter responded, not defensively, we're told, but from a sense of sadness because he'd been asked a third time. And so he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I phileo you. I love you like a brother." To which Jesus repeated his first command, "Then let my sheep eat." Sometimes shepherds can get in the way of the sheep eating. And Peter was supposed to be someone who was going to help them eat and not someone who was going to get in the way of them eating. Some have suggested that these three questions and their corresponding commands were meant to offset the 3 times that Peter had denied Jesus. Jesus had known then that Peter was going to deny him in advance, even if Peter didn't think that he would ever do so at the time. But this was now after that fact. This was now a repentant Peter, a forgiven and believing in the resurrected Lord Peter. It was an ashamed Peter of his failure. It was a hoping of a second chance Peter. Shame can paralyze even the best of us, filling us with a fear that we just might fail in the same way again. And so we avoid any situation that might bring us into that failure. But Jesus knew that Peter would not do so. He actually let Peter know what he knew about him in his future. That's what verse 18 is all about. Peter was becoming a person who would rather give up his freedom than ever deny Jesus again. Arrogance, which Peter was a little prone toward as he followed Jesus, keeps the focus on the shepherd rather than the sheep. And Peter was being taught that all of God's sheep needed to be fed, a task that was not beneath Peter if he really loved Jesus like he claimed he loved Jesus. It must have been good news for Peter to hear that he would be faithful to Jesus to the very end. That despite the opposition and the persecution that he would face, he didn't have to worry about failing. Peter didn't have to worry that he just might cave in if he was threatened again for his faith, for his association with Jesus. It does bring up that question, Some may think an unfair question. If someone had aimed a gun at you or threatened you with prison and asked if you were one of Jesus' disciples, would you lie to them in order to escape, as Peter did? Would you tell them what they wanted to hear, even if it wasn't really true? Would you do so because, well, you didn't want to get shot, you didn't want to get to be thrown in prison, you didn't want to be inconvenienced? Peter had gone that route before. Peter had already been on that road, and it wasn't the one that Jesus was calling him to. But he was just affirmed by Jesus that he would never be that way again. He had learned his lesson as an apostle. He would be one who would be leading the emerging church. And leading the emerging church, he had to do so as one who loved Jesus and expressed that love regardless of what anyone else thought or what anyone else would do to him as a result of it. He needed to lead not just by saying it whenever it was convenient to do so, but by living it. It was then that Jesus gave Peter a final command. He says, "Follow me." It just happens to be the very first thing that Jesus said to Peter that when he had spoken and called him 3 years before. And by Jesus giving this command to him now, our love for Jesus is intimately connected with our willingness to follow Jesus. The Greek word for follow, akulathumai, which means nothing to you, begins with another word that will mean nothing to you. It begins with a copulative prefix. You probably don't know what that is. I didn't know either until it was taught to me. It indicates that the next part of the Greek word is to be shared by the person who speaks it and the person who is hearing it. And the next part of the word that Jesus used meant a road or a way. And so Jesus in this word was commanding Peter to get on the same road that I'm on. Follow me. Not just in words, but you get on this same road that I'm walking on. On that road, Peter was to make sure that Jesus' sheep got fed. A shepherd would never say that they loved the sheep like a brother. They would show the sheep charity. That is, they would see the needs of the sheep, and the sheep have a lot of needs, and they would be compelled out of compassion to take care of those needs. The sheep that Jesus is talking about, of course, were the people who would come to believe that he is God's one and only Son, the Messiah, the Christ, just as Peter had confessed. Peter would have to round them up and lead them where they could graze, and he would have to look over them and protect them. He would have to go after those that wandered off, and he would have to be persecuted for it. But the focus would no longer be on Peter. They would be focused on the sheep. When it comes to believers, our food is the daily food of God's Word. It is that bread that we get whenever we encounter God and what he says and the commands and what he has revealed about himself to us, his love for us and his care for us and his desire for the very best for us. We really are not supposed to live on bread alone, but every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, as Jesus said. We need to hear it. We need to study it. We need to meditate on it. We need to believe it, and we need to live by it. And it was Peter's job to express this love by providing God's people what they needed. He needed to get out of the way so that they could eat. You know, when someone comes here, and even in my teaching like this, I don't want you to leave and say, man, I liked what Doug had to say. In fact, that's the worst thing you could say to me. As we gather as God's sheep, I hope that you hear from him. I hope that you feed on his word and never mine. Jesus invites all of us to get on the same road that he's walking on. He invites us, just as Peter did, to to imitate his example of being motivated by charity to others that are on that road and those maybe that are off that road, to see needs and to meet them. But he may call us to a different ministry on that road than that to which he called Peter. But just as Jesus equipped Peter for his ministry, he will equip you for your ministry. You might have to learn some hard lessons about love, just as Peter did, but he is going to prepare you to be on that same road, loving just like he loves. Our concern is not how or when he is going to use someone else on that road. If you keep reading this story, Peter kind of gets distracted by John, the one that Jesus loves, and wanting to know what's going to happen with him. And Jesus says, hey, wait a second. I'm talking to you about you following me. I'm not talking about how you're worried about someone else following me. You, Peter, follow me. We need to be concerned about following Jesus. Not how someone else is or how somebody else isn't. We need to be concerned how Jesus is going to use us to love like he loves. And like Peter, when you really start following Jesus, you'll probably get persecuted for it. Don't expect a bunch of slaps on the back. Don't expect a bunch of praise. How many sheep go around praising their shepherd for feeding them in a real flock sense? Now they know and they recognize the shepherd. I mean, when they show up and they open the gates and they get the food there, they sort of flock over there. They love that, but they're there to eat. And man, we need to keep the focus on God's people being nourished spiritually by God and his word and his spirit, that they may be equipped to be his people in this world. It all comes back to that first question. Remember that first question? Peter, do you love me more than these? Pointing to the other apostles, the other disciples, the other ones that Jesus had invited to follow him. Peter's answer most certainly should have been, no, Jesus. I don't love you more than these. They all love Jesus the same. Well, they would have if they answered those next two questions the same way. Do you love me? Yes. Do you love me? Yes. Whether agape or phileo, do you love me? And that's what Jesus is asking you. And if you love him, he's going to be inviting you onto that same road. And he's going to be calling you to follow him and live your life for him. We have a hymn of invitation. If you haven't heard Jesus' call to your life, I hope that you listen. He is going to be calling you. If you don't love him, I hope that you come to know him and his love for you so that you can respond to it in love. Would you please stand?